early 80s, early to mid 80s, there was a huge increase in political activity within the country.
During apartheid, we're talking
the apartheid era, and so anti-apartheid activity, right? And the repression was also quite huge. I mean, in Cape Town, for example, many Muslims were banned, were not allowed to speak, not allowed to meet more than 3 people at a time. At some points in 1986, I remember some of our Muslim Students Association T-shirts were banned. The Palestinian kufiya was banned in some areas in the Western Cape. So it was heightened political activity, and we were part of that in various different ways.
Today I'm meeting with Naeem Jeenah, an activist, a writer, an academic, with a commitment to social justice and a lot of troublemaking, a lot of controversial stories, and amazing cup of coffees every now and then. Naeem, thank you so much.
More than now and then, I mean.
Sorry, I had to bring it to that. Thank you so much for coming to my show.
Thank you for that brilliant introduction.
How would Naeem introduce himself? Who's Naeem Jeenah?
And that's fine, what you just did.
No, but how would you introduce yourself?
How would I introduce myself? So I often get asked this identity question, especially when I travel. And I describe myself as a Black South African Muslim, which of course confuses lots of people, because Black means something else in other parts of the world. But I think that encapsulates in many ways how I see myself. At the core of it, I'm Muslim. My life is dictated by my faith and my understanding of my faith and who I am. I'm South African because, God decided that this is where I'd be born and this is where I would live. And so I share in the trials and tribulations and struggles of the people here where I was born. And I'm politically Black in South Africa. And so, I think that in many ways that describes who I am, at least at a public level.
What does that mean for people who will, introduce themselves as apolitical? What does a person who's not, a Black or an African person introduce himself as a Black politically?
So the notion of Black as a political category comes, of course, from the Black consciousness era, right? And that is that in South Africa during apartheid, you had whites and everyone who wasn't white was Black, right? The apartheid term, of course, was non-white, which Black consciousness rejected. We are not non-anything, right? So if you're not white, you were Black. And the fact that under apartheid, different groups of Black people had different levels of oppression. Some were more privileged than others. So those who were categorized as Indian, for example, were more privileged than those classified as African or Bantu or whatever. At different times there were different terms used for them. Those who were colored were more privileged than African as well. So we recognize that those grades of privilege or grades of oppression, if you like, existed. But in total, all of them are Black from a political perspective, because politically speaking, you had white and Black in South Africa. The other categorization was a way of differentiating and dividing. And that the dividing of Black people was done very effectively by the apartheid system on so-called racial categories, because race doesn't really exist, as well as on linguistic basis, for example. So African people in South Africa were not just African people; they were Zulus and Xhosas and etc. Right? And so the apartheid terminology was that there's no majority and minority in South Africa. We are all minorities. So there are more white people in South Africa than there are paddies, for example, right? So how do you say that whites are a minority and they are a majority? So that's where the notion of being black in South Africa comes from.
We're speaking about South Africa and apartheid. How did these two location and event shaped your upbringing? I mean, how was the household that you grew up in? Your parents, your siblings, during apartheid and after, and how did that got you involved more in the political struggle?
So I grew up in a house that my family was classified as Indian by the apartheid regime, and in fact, all four of my grandparents were born in India. So I'm kind of second generation, third generation. My own personal experience of apartheid, although I didn't realize that that's what it was, nor did I know the word apartheid at the time, was when I was about 6 years old. When I was around 4 years old or 3 years old, my parents and I moved to Johannesburg and lived in Lenasia, which was so-called Indian township at the time.
You moved from Durban?
From Durban, which is where I was born and spent the first 3 years of my life. And we lived in Lens, but I didn't realize this. Of course, my parents did. We were living here illegally because Indians, as they would say, Indians who were citizens of Natal, now the KwaZulu-Natal province, but then called Natal, were not allowed to live in the Transvaal, which was the province where Johannesburg was. And if they were found to be living, and this happened in many cases in Lens, for example, they would be given 48 hours notice, and thereafter their houses would be shut. All their stuff would be thrown out onto the street, and the houses would be shut.
And they have to move somewhere else.
They have to go back to Durban, right, or to Natal. So for about 3 years, we lived in Lens illegally. My father had a job as a clerk in a company, and we lived there quite comfortably until I had to go to school. None of the schools in Lenasia would accept me because we were illegal. So talk about illegal immigrants. I was it from like 3 years old, and so we had to move back to Durban as a result of that. Otherwise, I couldn't go to school, right? And so, in a sense, that was my first kind of close-up experience of apartheid. I only understood that much later. But that was when I was 6 years old.
Did your parents speak to you about it, or you just told you it's not going to work and let's go?
I don't really remember, but I think it was something about, the government wouldn't allow it or something, which, didn't make any sense at the time. 8 years later, I was 14. In high school at the time in Durban, and I got recruited into the Muslim Youth Movement, and that's where my political activist journey began at the age of 14 in the Muslim Youth Movement, as what we would now, at that time the word didn't exist, but what we would now refer to as an Islamist. And so my political education, to a large extent, was from the Muslim Youth Movement. I then, after that, got involved in the Muslim Students Association, had some kind of relationship to the Black Consciousness Movement and other left organizations, etc. But my political anchor was the MY.
So, many, you're the second actually of our guests who mentioned the Muslim Youth Movement. But was it politically linked to any movement in the Middle East? I'm talking about the Ikhwan or so, or was it like something related to South Africa, to South Africans? What was the purpose of this movement? And I believe that did you continue in this movement even through your university, or was it just through high school at the beginning?
No, I remained in the Muslim. I mean, some might say that I still am involved in the Muslim Youth Movement. So, despite the name, very soon after it was established, it stopped being a youth organization and was very much a community organization. But when it started in 1970, The MOM started with, its objectives were very kind of religious and socio-cultural, right? It was a time when there was a global kind of sense of revival of Muslim identity. And so it was around that kind of issue, be proud to be a Muslim. If your name is Muhammad, don't call yourself Mo, those kinds of things. And so the huge, it grew very fast after it started. In Natal is where it started, grew very fast, had branches all over the country. It was vibrant, it was active. It would have an annual convention with 5,000 to 10,000 people would come each year. Its branches had kind of baseline activities that it would do, things like distributing blankets in winter, distributing meat after Eid, those kinds of things. So, socio-cultural kind of stuff. And then its members at universities tried to get facilities for Salah and make sure that it was halal food, So it was that kind of thing. That lasted until, that kind of phase, if you like, lasted until around 1977. And it was around 1977-78 that the movement then reoriented itself, reorganized itself. Its mass conventions of 5,000 to 10,000 people became annual tarbiyah programs of 200 people, still from across the country. Its branches were converted, and so not all of them converted, because many of the members at the time were much happier doing things like distributing blankets, were converted into what were called halakat, which are much more intense kind of study circles than that kind of social activity. And the social activity was an activity that existed, but on the side. It wasn't the central thing. And so from that time, it changed the way in which it operated. One might say ideologically as well. It began to align itself much more with the kind of more global Islamic revivalist tendency. Was never officially affiliated to any foreign organization officially. And there were many reasons for that. Among those reasons was the apartheid state and how it viewed Muslims. And if you were activist Muslims, there were other repercussions. And if you were activist Muslims with the foreign links, there were other repercussions. And so there were never any formal links with any such organizations. But ideologically, it was part of a kind of global thing. And that led it in the direction of becoming politically involved. So I said that was 77, 78. 1980, many MOM members, 1980 was when I joined the MOM, now you know how old I am. Many MOM members at the time were students and got involved in the national kind of student uprisings. And that began also to shape our own understanding of the political situation in South Africa. So our development as activists within the Muslim youth movement was very much one of praxis. It was kind of practical engagement with the politics and the kind of ideological Quranic perspective or theory, if you like, that comes together and influences each other. And then became more politically involved through the early 80s. So by the mid 80s, and then the other, you asked about any link or affiliation to kind of foreign organizations, but the other important thing to note here was that by the early 80s, early to mid 80s, there was a huge increase in political activity within the country.
During apartheid, we're talking
the apartheid era, and so anti-apartheid activity, right? And the repression was also quite huge. In Cape Town, for example, Many Muslims were banned, were not allowed to speak, not allowed to meet more than 3 people at a time. At some points in 1986, I remember some of our Muslim Students Association T-shirts were banned. The Palestinian kufiya was banned in some areas in the Western Cape. So it was heightened political activity, and we were part of that in various different ways. But by the mid 80s, by 1985, you had among the activist Muslim groups, or I should say activist Islamic groups, because groups that defined themselves on the basis of Islam, there were kind of 3 tendencies. There was a Muslim Youth Movement, which was the oldest of this, and allied to the Muslim Youth Movement was the Muslim Students Association, and I'll say a little more about that.
MSA now.
MSA, yes. At that time, a national organization. Now, not so much. You had an organization that was formed in 1980. Which 1980, the year is important because it comes just after the Iranian Revolution, and inspired by the Iranian Revolution, called Qibla, right, led by Ahmed Qasim at the time, who passed away not too long ago. And Qibla, despite its kind of protestations about the liberation movement in general, many of its members were aligned to the Pan-Africanist Congress. In 1983, you had an organization that was formed which broke away from the MYM. And broke away from the MYM because they couldn't convince the MYM of this position. Called Muslims Against Oppression. They then came out with a pamphlet called Call of Islam, and then changed the name of the organization to Call of Islam. And they were aligned to the Congress movement, to the UDF at the time, which was kind of the internal wing, if you like, of the ANC. So you had the Qibla aligned in some ways to the PAC. You had Call of Islam aligned to the ANC and the Congress movement, and the MYM MSA, which took a position of what it referred to as positive neutrality. And the way we defined it was that we would not align with any of these tendencies, neither the Congress tendency, nor the Africanist, nor the Black consciousness tendency as an organization, or as 2 organizations. But we were willing to engage with all of them on specific campaigns. And at different times, in different parts of the country, MYM members, either individually or as MYM, was involved in activities of what at some point became known as the Mass Democratic Movement, which was a Congress thing. At other times had campaigns with the Black Consciousness Movement, etc. And we felt that was a much more useful way, rather than aligning with any particular tendency. That proved to have its own pros and cons. In my opinion, more pros than cons later. But so, my view would be that what we created was a kind of Islamic tendency in the liberation movement in South Africa, despite the fact that, as you know, Muslims make up like 2% of the population.
You took us deep immediately. I was staging for that, but I'm glad you brought.
So let me also say one more thing about your thing about linking to foreign organizations.
But before you're saying that, MYM, is it still? Does it still exist?
It still exists. It still exists. Still exists as a national organization, and the others not really. Neither of the other 2, but MYM still exists. So in terms of the kind of inspiration, ideological connection to other such movements in different parts of the world, there are 2 interesting organizations here. One is the Muslim Youth Movement of South Africa, and the other is ABIM, Angkatan Bela Islam Malaysia, Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia. And both of these organizations operated in different ways, but essentially Muslim minority contexts. At the time, Malaysia, the Muslim population was about 48%, right? Muslim population in South Africa, 2%. So we started this ideological kind of understanding, talking about, the need for an Islamic state. It didn't take us too long, both separately, not together, separately. It didn't take us too long to realize that this doesn't work in our context, right? And so we redefined what Islamic movement means in South Africa, for example, to say that you're part of the Islamic movement if you're part of an organized Muslim formation that is involved in the struggle against apartheid and for justice. No talk about an Islamic state, different kind of priorities, different understandings, etc.
Before continuing in these topics, I just want to go back a little bit, not too far, to the incident that happened with your brother in Durban. Can you tell us about it?
Well, you're not going back; you're going forward.
So we're going
that
forward.
was So my brother Muhsin was involved in the student movement at campus. He was at Emel Sultan Technikon studying journalism at the time. He was also involved in the Muslim Students Association at the time, responsible for publications. And then there was a group of MSA members by that time, late 80s, early 90s. Who were not involved in the Muslim youth movement. Some of them were involved with Qibla, and a fewer than that, with the Call of Islam. So he was in the MSA and involved with Qibla. He in January 1994, he was martyred by the police. Now it's interesting. It was 3 months before our election, our first democratic election. He was martyred by the police in Durban. The official version of the story is that so there's two official versions. The first official version, which lasted about 12 hours, was that he and 3 other fighters from the Azanian People's Liberation Army, which was the armed wing of the PAC, that at 1 o'clock in the morning, they launched an attack on a police station in the middle of Durban in Pine Street, small satellite police station. I say there's 2 versions of that because about 12 hours later, they changed that to he and 2 others. So there were 4 people killed that night. Initially, they said 4 Upla terrorists. Then 12 hours later, they admitted that one of those 4 was actually a security guard at a shop, and he was killed accidentally. Of the 3 who were killed, one was my brother. The other 2 at the time were buried, unidentified.
Until now.
So not really, because just recently, like months ago, we finally discovered the identity of one of them. So the 3 of them, so the story is that, second official version, is that they launched this attack. They opened fire on this police station, and then they were fired upon and killed. There's lots of problems with the story. For one, the police say that they were tipped off, that this was going to happen. And so the whole area, there were lots of unmarked police cars waiting. But these 3 guys, initially 4, these 3 guys walked onto like a 4, 5, 6 maybe lane street in the middle of the city at 1 o'clock in the morning. So there's no people around or even cars. Walked onto that scene with AK-47s and grenades. And these cops in the police vehicles didn't do anything. They just left them. They came to across the road, so 5 lanes across the road from the police station, and opened fire with their AK-47s. The police still didn't do anything. And then one of them ran across the road, climbed about 4 stairs and to where the police station was, and then lobbed a grenade into the police station. That's when they responded, and he was shot right outside the door of the police station. The other 2, instead of running away, also crossed the road and tried to run away on the one side. The one was shot just after he crossed the road. And the last one, my brother, about 200 meters down the road, was shot, and his legs were completely shattered and with high velocity bullets, shredded. Had a bullet in his lung and one at the back of his neck, which seems to be kind of execution style. The other two people, as I said, were buried unidentified. Or the other thing that the police said was that, so these guys came on to the scene with the AK-47s and the grenades. Before they did anything to the police station, they then went to a wall nearby and they spray painted slogans on the wall. This is how good, soldiers they were. Mm-hmm. They spray painted slogans on the wall, Apla slogans. And to just prove how good soldiers they were, they got the slogans wrong. Right? We saw the slogans and they were not the kind of slogans that... so that's the official version of the story. We, to date, don't know what the true version is. Whether my brother actually was an Apla operative, it's possible. If he was, he wouldn't have told us, obviously. Or whether he, as his journalism mentor at the time, suggested that he was set up. So so this happened at 1 o'clock in the morning. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the cops raided my mother's flat, where my brother and my mother lived together in the center of Durban. Raided her flat and took a whole lot of his things away, including a jacket, including some books. And one of the things that wasn't there was his reporter's notebook, which is, the reporters always carry their own. His reporter's notebook wasn't there, right? And so his mentor at the Sunday Tribune, where he was a kind of cub journalist, said that he believed that Muhsin was got a tip-off for a story and went to cover a story, and was set up. God knows
also
best.
Possible.
We don't know what the real story is. So yeah, that was Muhsin.
Moving from there back to MYM, but through your wife Shamima. Can you tell us about how did that happen?
What happened?
meeting your wife.
How did I meet my wife? So Shamima was at the time, so this was in 1985. I was at medical school in Durban, University of Natal Medical School. She was at the University of Durban Westville. I was at the time the president of the Muslim Students Association. She was on the executive of the Islamic Society of UDW, University of Durban Westville, which was an affiliate of the Muslim Students Association. And mid 1985, there was a campaign launched by FOSATU, the Federation of South African Trade Unions, the precursor to COSATU, a Don't Buy White campaign to boycott white shops. In Durban in particular, it was broader than just Durban. And the Muslim Students Association took a decision to support the campaign. So the one afternoon, the coordinator of the campaign had arranged for volunteers, MSA volunteers from different campuses around Durban to meet and then to do a pamphlet and sticker blitz in the city center in Durban. So we went to the bus ranks, taxi ranks, handing out pamphlets and stickering poles and all of that. So he collected a whole lot of us together. As I said, I was president of the MSA at the time, gave us a briefing, and then just randomly paired people off and said, you and you going there, you and you going to this place, and I got paired off with this woman to go to the Beatrice Street bus rank and distribute pamphlets on the bus. We grabbed our pamphlets.
That was in Johannesburg.
In Durban. We grabbed our pamphlets and we walked fast to get to the bus rank so that we get maximum number of people. Got into the first bus to distribute pamphlets and promptly got arrested. The two of us together, this woman and I, and then we were taken to what was then called CR Swart Police Station, now Durban Central Police Station, and locked up in a room together. We were there for about, I think, 6 hours or so. locked up. They didn't put us in a cell. For some odd reason, they put us in this room together. If they put us in cells, of course, we would have been separated. And then at some point, someone from the security branch came and interrogated each one of us separately. But that woman that I got locked up in the room with was Shamima, who I didn't know before. I mean, I had seen her, but we'd never spoken or anything before. And now we sat in this room together with no one to talk to except each other. And she seemed like a really pleasant person. Alhamdulillah. At some point towards the end of that period, when the security branch guy came and he called me in, I was 20, never been arrested before, never engaged with the security branch police before, and was really scared. I mean, it felt like I was there for hours. I don't think it was more than 20, 30 minutes that he interrogated me, threatened me, he's going to lock me up under Section 29 of the Internal Security Act, all kinds of things, wanted all kinds of information, etc. And then, dismissed me and said, send that woman in. So she went in, and 5 minutes later, she came out smiling. I was sweating. She was smiling. And I said, what happened? And she said, well, I went in and I told him that this is my name, this is my address, this is where I'm studying and what I'm studying. And that's all I'm going to tell you, and I'm not answering any of your questions. And he asked her a few questions, and she refused to answer, and he sent her out. And I said, my God, I could marry this woman. We got married 2 years later.
Love in between the jail bars, as they say.
Alhamdulillah.
Tell us more about Shamima. I mean, in a lot of your conversation, you would bring her up briefly. There was a lot of influence in your life from Shamima. You had Minhaj and Shira from her as well, and you wrote the book that we're going to speak about, which is a trip that you went with her for Hajj. Who was she?
So Shamima was not from Durban. She was from what is now called Polokwane, at the time called Petersburg in Limpopo province, northernmost province. She was studying at the time, as I said, at UDW. She had studied there before, 1979, 1980, then gone home for a few years and then come back to complete her degree. She was, when we met, when we were arrested together, she was 25, just about to complete her degree. And really vibrant, very confident person. I've said to people that one of the most fearless people that I have ever met, and courageous, and that showed in all her interactions with people. But as Don Matera, the late famous poet, said of her, she epitomized, he said, she epitomized compassion. Don Matera embraced Islam because, for a simple reason, that someone explained to him the meaning of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. This big political activist, leader in the Black consciousness movement, author and poet, became a Muslim because someone explained to him what Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim means. The notion of that you start anything as a Muslim, you say, in the name of Allah, the compassionate. And for him, that was what turned him, to Islam. And he regarded Shamima as as epitomizing compassion. So that's the kind of person she was. When we got married, she, as I said, she had been involved in the Muslim Students Association when she was at campus. Then she went back home. She graduated, went back home. We got married 2 years later. So for 2 years she taught at a school. Had not been involved in the Muslim youth movement until later.
But was she politically involved?
She was politically very involved. She was involved with the Black consciousness movement, both at home. At the time, Petersburg was more kind of BC than Congress. So she was involved there with the BC movement. When she was at campus, she was involved with the BC movement as well. And then, sometime after we got married, she then got involved in the Muslim youth movement as well, became the Transvaal chairperson, was elected Transvaal chairperson of the MYM. At the time, this was early 90s, I don't remember which year exactly, she was only the second woman to be on the MYM's national executive. And then in 1993, at the General Assembly of the MYM, there was a resolution taken to create what was called the Muslim Youth Movement Gender Desk. And she was elected as its first coordinator. Position she held until she passed away in 1998. That is what she is probably most well known for. Her role in terms of women's empowerment, and particularly Muslim women's empowerment, and her role in the MYM Gender Desk, and this now kind of funny story of the 23rd Street Mosque, where a group of women decided to go and pray Taraweeh, and were kind of ignored and allowed to pray until the 27th night, when they were kicked out to the back into a tent.
I don't understand, why is that a major thing? Because in other countries, men and women can pray in masjid, separately.
In other countries and in South Africa now,
yes.
But we're talking about 1988, 1991, I think it was, when in particularly Natal and Transvaal. So Transvaal, what now is Gauteng, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, 3 provinces, and Northwest Province, 4 provinces were all part of what was called Transvaal. Muslims in Natal and Transvaal, there were hardly any masajid that had facilities for women.
Because of apartheid, or because...
No, because of the Muslim conservatism.
Okay.
It was, very sad in general, but very sad in many ways. Muslim women completely excluded from the masajid. In Cape Town, there were more masajid that had some facilities, not necessarily great facilities, definitely not equal facilities, but facilities. But in Joburg, you'd be lucky if you found 1 or 2 masajid. So the 23rd Street Mosque, which by then had pretended to be somewhat progressive, a bit different from other masajid, they had a diversity of speakers for Jumu'ah, etc. These women decided, well, this was they're progressive. They speak about women in Islam at Jumu'ah, etc. So this is a place we should go to pray Taraweeh. And so they did. And they prayed upstairs. There's a downstairs section, upstairs section. They prayed upstairs for the first 26 nights. Then the 27th night, which is the busiest night in Ramadan, of course, the trustees of the masjid decided, they put up a tent in the back and told the women to go into the tent because there'll be men that will want to pray upstairs. So these men who didn't come for 26 nights, on the 27th night, they must be given the space that the women had. And it was raining and parts of the tent flooded. So Shamima and a few other women decided that they're going to pray where they prayed for 26 nights. And they went up to that place and were almost assaulted by one of the men. But that became a big thing and attracted lots of attention, and probably one of the things she's more notorious for. But she was, as I said, as head of the Muslim Youth Movement Gender Desk, or coordinator of the Muslim Youth Movement Gender Desk, traveled around the country in that capacity. And her objective really was that the issue of women's rights in Islam is not some kind of an elitist or academic discussion. It's not about writing papers and books. It's about working class Muslim women and the rights that they have in their masajid, in their homes, etc. Right? And so, I would be trailing along behind her as she went to, because she didn't drive, very, very oddly, so I had to drive her around the country, trailing behind her as she went from one township to another, where we had MYM members holding workshops, handing over big sets of readings to people, etc. She, in 1995, end of 1994, some thereabouts, developed cancer, breast cancer, and passed away in January 1998. That didn't really, no, not her passing away, the cancer didn't really stop her. After initially getting kind of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, the cancer then came back a year or so later. And then, not long after, decided no more chemo. I mean, her thing was that she would rather be working until her last breath than lying in a hospital sick. And so, 2 weeks, just over 2.5 weeks before she passed away, traveled from Joburg, where we lived at the time, to Durban, flew to Durban, drove down to the south coast to the As-Salam Institute, where the Islamic Tarbiyah program of the MYM was being held, presented a paper at that program before coming back home, and passed away a few weeks later.
We have like a few minutes left, and I still have a lot of stages to cover, so I want to go through a couple of them, but one of the things that
I talk too much.
No.
We can edit it later.
One of the things that when I did my research and when I spoke to a lot of people, Naeem is known for some controversial Islamic views.
That's not true.
I mean, we can tell. I mean, I'm not sure if that was from developing like this relationship with your late wife, or was it like because you thought like South Africa has issues with these kind of views? One of the things that I heard, I mean, you can correct me, women are allowed to lead the salah, and women in the masjid, and all of these things, and I'm sure you heard all of these things. So what is
well, when I was 14 years old, I joined an organization which was extremely controversial. Why was it controversial? Because the Muslim youth movement said things like, for example, that if you don't understand Arabic, you should read the Quran in its translated form. At the time, the ulama in South Africa were vehemently opposed to that idea. In fact, in some Muslim bookshops, they would sell translations of the Quran from under the table, right? Why? Because the discourse at the time was that only the ulama can understand, can understand the Quran. And so if you want to know what the Quran says, you go to an alim, most of whom didn't understand Arabic, by the way, and read the translation in Urdu mostly. You go to an alim, and he, because it's of course not a she, he will explain it to you, right? I mean, I was 14. I wondered what happened to Arab children who started, learn to read Arabic at 6 and 7 years old, whether their parents prevented them from reading the Quran, because they would because the discourse was that if you're not an alim and you read the Quran, you'll be misled, you'll be misguided. Okay, so that was very controversial. We used to our halakat used to be reading and discussing the Quran, reading and discussing a hadith, which also, you can't read the hadith and understand it unless you have an alim with you. So, I started my life as an Islamic activist with very controversial people. May Allah bless them all. With these very controversial ideas, which now you go to Ijtima of the Tabligh Jama'ah, and you'll find people reading translation of the Quran. So it's no longer controversial, but at the time it was. The idea that women should have a space in the masjid, an extremely controversial thing at the time, right? I mean, I said Shamima and others almost got beaten up And this was at a so-called liberal or progressive masjid where they almost got beaten up. Imagine the other masajid. I mean, you'd have women, families who would travel from one town to another in the Transvaal, for example, which is very spread out, would stop for salah at a masjid, and the husband and father would go into the masjid to pray, and the mother would sit in the car and would then have to pray qadha when she reached her destination because she couldn't. I mean, this is ridiculous, So but the idea of women having a space in the masjid, just any space, let alone an equal space, was very controversial. So, long before I met controversial Shamima Sheikh, I grew up with the idea with controversial Islamic ideas.
Sorry, I'm gonna
Yes,
try
sure,
to keep
please.
it short. Before I go to the Hajj, and I'm gonna ask for it to be short as well. You spoke to me about the idea of raising children not for us. Many parents, they raise their children, they invest in their education, all of that, whether it's Islamically or secularly, for later the children to be around us and to help us and all of that. You had like a different thing about that.
It's very unfair that we have conversations in my kitchen and then you raise them in an interview. No, I mean, children are an amana that Allah has, a trust that Allah has given us. And for that, we have various responsibilities. We love them, we teach them love, we provide for them, we teach them that it's their responsibility when they're able to provide for other people. And we teach them to be good human beings, and if you're a Muslim, a good Muslim, an upright person, a just person, a compassionate person, etc. When they reach adulthood, you've either done your job of teaching them well or you haven't, and then you release them into the world, and whether they come back to you or not is up to them. You don't bring up children so that they might farm your land when you're old. Right? If they do well, that's alhamdulillah. But that's you bring up children so that you might give to the world morally upright and compassionate and just human beings that will make the world a better place.
The journey to Hajj with Shamima, there's like a lot of beautiful, like inspiring, spiritual, moments through your book. What was the most inspiring about it, if you can summarize it to us? I know it's a difficult job.
So the book is called Journey of Discovery, a South African Hajj. We undertook the Hajj, interestingly, about 9 months before Shamima passed away. So by then her one side of her hip had collapsed. She was limping.
So she wasn't in the best condition at that
time? No, not in the best condition. But she insisted on walking the Hajj. Yeah. It was. I mean, it's interesting because that was also the Hajj of the fire in Mina. On the first
incident
day.
Happened.
There was gas tank blew up and this fire just spread throughout Mina and stopped just before the South African camp. So when the fire blew up, we all had to walk back in the middle of the day, like around midday, walk back to Makkah. And she walked. I mean, we walked to Mina, we walked back to Makkah. But then because we were in Makkah, we took a bus to Arafah. But the rest of it, we walked back from Arafah to Mina, and Mina, all with limping. So it was, we went with, there were 4 of us, myself, Shamima, my mother, and a friend of ours. It was for us an extremely important journey.
For us, yourself?
Myself and Shamima in particular. I mean, I'm sure it was important for my mother and our friend as well, Aisha. But for Shamima and I, it was extremely important. It showed us new depths of our own love for each other, and our love and relationship separately and together with Allah. And so, we extremely grateful for that experience, even in the kind of circumstance where she was as ill as she was. that really was life-changing for both of us, and I think very important. So you asked kind of some inspirational. So let me give you one from Shamima's perspective. It's a chapter in the book that she wrote. So we wrote different chapters separately and some chapters together, etc. But she wrote this one chapter called "To Run Where Hajar Runs." And this was about the sa'i, running between Safa and Marwa, which for her was, some might find it strange, but for her was the kind of highlight of the Hajj. For me, the highlight was Medina, and praying, in the Rawda, and for her it was the sa'i. And the reason for it was the story of Hajar, being left there alone, being left. One might say to her own devices, but not really. I mean, being left to in complete trust of Allah, and she accepts that trust, that responsibility, looking for some way to feed her child, her baby, not child, her baby, but leaving the finding of the provisions to her Creator, and then the well of Zamzam, etc. The whole story of this black slave woman, right? Which, as Ali Shariati says, what more kind of despicable person can you find? Black slave and woman, right? And she's elevated to the extent where not only is this ritual after her, the sa'i we still do even when we go for Umrah, not only Hajj. So every single day people are doing sa'i. Not only that, but she has the honor of being buried in the Kaaba, right? And so that for Shamima was kind of really the highlight, the sa'i and the story around it.
I would really want to go, and I had a lot of questions about the Hajj from the book, but we're running out of time.
We'll do another episode just on Hajj.
I want to talk about one of the most important things that we ask all our guests here, Palestine. Palestine in your life, when did it surface? And I know with a lot of guests, Palestine was there from the beginning, but in your case, it might be different. But also, Palestine in South Africa is a very interesting, loving and hate kind of relationship, if that's the right term. There's a lot of animosity, if that's the English term, in between the solidarity work here in Palestine, as well as amazing kind of strength in the work that they do. I mean, the one of the results that we can say is the ICJ that the government took from the activists on the ground to lead to what we are in now. When did Palestine surface in Naeem Jeenah's life, and where is it now in Naeem Jeenah's life?
So let me repeat what I've said about half a dozen times already. When I was 14,
there's a lot of things that happened in there.
So I mean, the point about being 14 was that's when I joined the MYM, and that was also 1980 with the national student uprisings. Right? But when I was 14, I joined the Muslim Youth Movement. And for the Muslim Youth Movement, struggles for justice around the world were our struggles. Particularly, not only, but particularly struggles in Muslim countries. So from then already, Palestine was a big thing. By the way, related to your earlier question, at the time, in 1980, raising the issue of Palestine in the Muslim community was a very controversial thing. Why?
In the Muslim community?
Oh. Because politics was a controversial thing. Muslims, you either chose to be Muslim or you chose to be politically involved. You couldn't be both for many. So those people, such as Muhammad Dango, who you told me you're going to interview, who decided that they were Muslim and politically involved. They did it against enormous odds. The community leadership, the ulama, etc. I mean, there were some parts of the ulama that referred to political involvement as kufr politics. It's not something that Muslims, or at least decent Muslims, should get involved in. And so I have friends, for example, I mean, a very close friend until he passed away, Harun Patel, who was at one point the deputy president of the Azanian People's Organization, which, you know, in the 80s was one of the in the 70s and 80s, one of the biggest anti-apartheid organizations in the country. Hafidhul Quran, who told me that after 1976 he left Islam. And that's because when he raised the issue of the struggle against apartheid and the struggle for justice with Muslims, they told him, no, that's not what Islam is about. So he left Islam. He returned in the early 90s, joined the MYM, worked full-time for the MYM until he passed away. But so people were given that kind of choice. So even Palestine was an issue of politics, right? And therefore, I remember that the Muslim Students Association, we did a nationwide tour doing presentations. And at one masjid in Natal at the time, in Pietermaritzburg, we made sure that the guy who was going to stand up in the masjid after the salah to make the announcement that we're going to have this presentation on Palestine in the hall, not in the masjid, that we made sure that there were enough people sitting around him so that he'd be protected if someone jumped up to attack him. Right, so even that was that was the beginning of my involvement in Palestinian solidarity. But let me make this point that we look at a period in the 1980s, which is my involvement, and early 90s, when Palestine was largely an issue that was raised by the Islamic movement. Right. Occasionally, some or other leftist organization would have a pamphlet about it, particularly after 1982 Sabra Shatila anniversary, a pamphlet about it. Some of them, BC people, some socialists, would speak on an MYM or MSA platform about it. But there wasn't more activity around Palestine. I mean, in some ways understandable, because, South Africa, we had our own struggles, and the 1980s was hectic struggles. But it was particularly the MSA and MYM, and then later Qibla and Call of Islam to some extent, that flew that flag. The first solidarity organization that was formed outside of the Muslim organizations was in 1998, 4 years after our first democratic election, when the Palestine Solidarity Committee was formed in Joburg, now called the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. But until then, it was mainly a Muslim thing. Right, and so that's how I got introduced to the issue of Palestine from those days. And then I was a founder member of the Palestine Solidarity Committee, and the Muslim Youth Movement at the time decided that it's going to throw its activity on Palestinian solidarity in with the Palestine Solidarity Committee. That what was required was a broad solidarity movement that was beyond the Muslim community and beyond even politically ideological groups. And so it was better for MYM activists to be involved in those, if you like, I don't like, but if you like the term, secular organizations than in Muslim organizations. And so that's, I went there and various other organizations thereafter, including international organizations.
I want to end up with a big question that might take like a long way to answer.
You ask all your questions are big questions with long answers. So.
I'm trying to use the time that we have. You are the founder and director of EMIC, Africa Middle East
Afro Middle East
Center, which had a lot of research, books, conferences about the Middle East, South Africa, and Palestine, and Africa and Palestine. And also you are a senior researcher now at the organization
Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection.
And there's a lot of involvement in the internal South African policy with the government. Where do you see South Africa going forward now with the new government? that is, with all these variety of colors and geopolitical dynamic that is happening. And where is it going with Palestine, especially that South Africa is taking, took Israel to the ICJ, and kind of, I don't know if that's the right time, when won the case, and Netanyahu and Gallant now they have this warrant arrest. I know it's two big questions.
Many big questions. First, just a little correction. I wasn't the founder of the Afro-Middle East Center.
Oh.
So I became executive director of the of AMEC in 2008. But it was founded in 1998, and the first executive director was Wadda Khanfar, who was living in South Africa at the time. And then in 1998, 2002, 2003, went to Qatar to become the head of Al Jazeera network, right? And then it temporarily closed down, and I reopened it in 2008. In terms of your question about the the South African government now, it's a very interesting position. We, for the first time at a national level, have a coalition government. The African National Congress, which had been the governing party from 1994 until May this year, or until June this year, didn't get a majority in the election, didn't get more than 50% in the May election, and so has been forced to govern in a coalition. So it's a new experience. It's also a very kind of interesting and sometimes worrying experience because of the diversity of the parties that are in that government. You have on the one hand the ANC, kind of social democratic party. The next biggest party is the Democratic Alliance, which is a liberal/neoliberal party. You have a party who is most well known for being xenophobic, the Patriotic Alliance, and has a minister there. You have a party that regards itself as a Muslim or Islamic party who has a deputy minister, Al Jamah, Deputy Minister of Social Development. So it's quite a mixed bag, right? And that should be a little concerning to all South Africans, because a mixed bag like that, you can legitimately ask the question, where would it go, and what productive things would come out of it, if anything. Now, just July, August, September, October, so for almost 5 months after the elections, I think we can say that there's some settling taking place, but that we're not seeing any kind of major changes from where things were in terms of policy from before. There's some fights that have taken place around
internally now
in the government.
Yes.
Some fights that have taken place around the national health insurance, for example, around the education bill on language of education, etc. And there'll be others. But in general, the policies are the same. I'm not necessarily saying that policies are great. I mean, even before the election, some of the ANC's policies, kind of, one might argue, neoliberal, not pro-poor, etc. But that hasn't changed to a substantial degree. One of the issues, and linked to your earlier question, the government's position on Palestine has essentially remained unchanged from the ANC government up to May and the government of national unity. It seems to me that there's been a decision taken by the other parties, the pro-Israeli parties, which are maybe two of them, the Democratic Alliance, the second biggest party, the Patriotic Alliance, not to raise international relations issues and not to make not to allow international relations policy differences to divide the government. And I think that's good on the Palestinian issue. There's been no slacking off from the government on the ICJ case, despite the fact that the minister who you've interviewed, Naledi Pandor, has now changed. And the new minister is the person who was Minister of Justice before that. The ICJ case is still going full steam ahead. The position on Palestine remains unchanged. So I think that there's positive things from that perspective. There are other issues, other policy issues, particularly domestic, that I think that there will be other fights that will come up, and we'll see them playing out both publicly and inside cabinet as well. But for now, things don't look like the country is going to fall apart, or like the government is going to become right-wing, or any more right-wing than it is, I should say. So yeah, we watch and see.
Thank you so much. I literally had a lot of questions. Maybe we one day will do another episode on the
Part 2, inshallah.
But thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate all of that. And maybe one day we'll do a third episode about the Hajj book as well. Inshallah. Thanks a lot, and until our next episode, goodbye.